We must remember that this truth consciousness of the Vedic rishis is a supramental plane, a level of the hill of being, Ardri Asinu, which is beyond our ordinary reach and to which we have to climb with difficulty. It is true that in the Vedic writings Saraswati is spoken of as the secret self of Indra, an expression, we may observe, that is void of sense if Saraswati is only a northern river and Indra the god of the sky, but has a very profound and striking significance if Indra be the illumined mind and Saraswati the inspiration that proceeds from the hidden plane of the supramental truth. But it is impossible to give Saraswati so important a place with regard to the other gods as would be implied by interpreting the phrase Man Mahato Aravasya in the sense by the greatness of Saraswati. The cow is really Aditi, the infinite consciousness hidden in the subconscient, and the triple G-tam is the triple clarity of the liberated sensation finding its secret of delight, of the thought mind attaining to light and intuition and of the truth itself, the ultimate supramental vision. This is clear from the second half of the verse in which it is said, one Indra produced, one Suya, one the gods fashioned by natural development out of Vina, for Indra is the master of the thought mind, Suya of the supramental light, Vina is Soma, the master of mental delight of existence, creator of the sense mind. This is clear from the second half of the verse in which it is said, one Indra produced, one Suya, one the gods fashioned by natural development out of Vina, for Indra is the master of the thought mind, Suya of the supramental light, Vina is Soma, the master of mental delight of existence, creator of the sense mind. If the idea of the truth that we have found in the very opening hymn of the Veda really carries in itself the contents we have supposed and amounts to the conception of a supramental consciousness which is the condition of the state of immortality or beatitude, and if this be the leading conception of the Vedic rishis, we are bound to find it recurring throughout the hymns as a center for other and dependent psychological realizations. This wine of Soma represents, as we have abundant proof in the Veda and especially in the 9th book, a collection of more than 100 hymns addressed to the deity Soma, the intoxication of the Ananda, the divine delight of being, inflowing upon the mind from the supramental consciousness through the Artam or truth. If we accept these interpretations, we can easily translate the hymn into its psychological significance. All is based on the central Vedic conception of the supramental or truth consciousness towards which the progressively perfected mentality of the human being labors as towards a consummation and a goal. He is the master of truth, Suya the illuminator, Savitri the creator, Pushan the increaser. His rays in their own nature are supramental activities of revelation, inspiration, intuition, luminous discernment, and they constitute the action of that transcendent principle which the Vedanta calls Vijnana, the perfect knowledge, the Vedaritam, the truth. He follows, sun-like, the march of the dawn, illuminating all the regions of our being on which falls its light, for there is always needed the precursory mental illumination before the truth itself, the supramental principle, can take possession of this lower existence. The one is described as Bhma with Macron, the large, the other as Alpa, the little. Another name for this supramental or truth consciousness is Mahas, which also means the great, the vast. Thus in these 4 verses of the opening hymn of the Veda we get the first indications of the principal ideas of the Vedic rishis, the conception of a truth consciousness supramental and divine, the invocation of the gods as powers of the truth to raise man out of the fossils of the mortal mind, the attainment in and by this truth of an immortal state of perfect good and felicity, and the inner sacrifice and offering of what one has and is by the mortal to the immortal as the means of the divine consummation. To know, possess and be the divine being in an animal and egoistic consciousness, to convert our twilight or obscure physical mentality into the plenary supramental illumination, to build peace and a self-existent bliss where there is only a stress of transitory satisfactions besieged by physical pain and emotional suffering, to establish an infinite freedom in a world which presents itself as a group of mechanical necessities, to discover and realize the immortal life in a body subjected to death and constant mutation. This is offered to us as the manifestation of God in matter and the goal of nature in her terrestrial evolution. It is from her, as she comes thus richly laden, Vyenavini, that Agni, the divine force laboring here in body and mind to uplift the mortal, prays for and attains to the Soma, the wine of the beatitude, the delightful substance. The supramental world in us, foundation of the truth, is the foundation of the dawns. Now also let Indra use the Maruts as his instruments for the illumination. By them let him establish the supramental knowledge of the seer. By their energy his energy will be supported in the human nature, and he will give that nature his divine firmness, his divine force, so that it may not stumble under the shock or fail to contain the vaster play of puissant activities too great for our ordinary capacity. They carry man in their ship to the other shore beyond the thoughts and states of the human mind, that is to say, to the supramental consciousness, Na with Macron Va with Macron Matin prior, I.46.7. Shuri, daughter of the sun, lord of the truth, mounts their car as their bride. This is the highest possible state of our knowledge when mind fulfills itself in the supramental. Such is the scheme of the human understanding upon which the conclusions of the most ancient Vedanta were built. It destroys the enemy, the assailants, the powers of evil, enriches the soul with all they try to withhold, gives the triple peace and the triple fulfillment of the mental, vital and physical being, and, laboring in the light of the supramental truth, leads beyond, creating in us the world of immortal felicity. Mental, vital, physical, the lower births, all the knowledge of which the divine will, knower of our births, possesses, and through which it has to lead the ascending sacrifice to the supramental. The peace, joy and full satisfaction in the mental, vital and physical being. Not only the physical body, but the vital and mental sheaths, all the embodied states or forms of the soul. The supramental world has to be formed or created in us by the divine will as the result of a constant expansion and self-perfecting. The herds are the illuminations that come to us from the supramental truth, herding rays of the sun of light. By this new action of the divine force the mental and physical consciousness are wedded to the high supramental which was till now separated from them, and the life force blazing in its works with the heat of the divine sun is harmonized with the play of the sun ray of the divine knowledge. Aditi, the infinite consciousness, mother of all things. With the all-embracing vision of the supramental infinite consciousness. Aditi, her dark state or black form is Diti, mother of the powers of darkness. The intellect and intelligent will form a bridge by which the mental being is trying to establish a conscious connection with the supramental and to prepare the embodied soul for the descent into it of a supramental action. Therefore the first process is easy, spontaneous, rapid, perfect, the second slow, labored, imperfect. In any case there would, at first sight, appear to be no warrant in reason for attributing a sense of the sense to that which is not embodied, to a supramental consciousness which has no need of any such instrumentation. Mind would be masterful, creative, originative, not as with us either obedient to matter and merely reproductive, or else in struggle with it and only with difficulty able to modify a material predetermined and dully reluctant to its touch. It would be, subject to whatever supramental power might be above it, master of a ductile and easily responsive material. In proportion as the intellectual action becomes associated with and dominated by a rudimentary supramental action, and it is this which constitutes the phenomenon of genius, the second process also becomes more and more easy, spontaneous, rapid and perfect. The divine will becomes the enjoyer Bhaga, brother power of Mitra, who enjoys all delight of existence but by Mitra's power of pure discernment and according to the light, truth and harmony of the divine living. The gods, the divine force contains and sustains all the other divine powers in their working, in him resides therefore the power of all the other godheads. The whole physical and the whole mental consciousness become full of the knowledge which streams into them from the supramental plane, and they, as it were, turn into the supramental light and action around the divine seer will as he moves about in them at his work of transfiguration. The means for the attainment of this highest knowledge is the constant preparation of the mind by the admission into it of a working higher than itself until the mind is capable of giving itself up to the supramental action which exceeds it and which will finally replace it. For just as life consciousness is beyond the imprisoned material being and unattainable by it through its own instruments, so this supramental consciousness is beyond the divided and dividing nature of mind and unattainable by it through its own instruments. But, for this very reason, the feeling out, the attempt at acquisition can only succeed in proportion as the mental being abandons his characteristic mentality and its limitations in order to rise beyond to that mind of the mind which is his origin and his secret governing principle. His mentality must admit supramentality as life has admitted mind. So long as he worships, follows after, adheres to all this that he now accepts as the object of his pursuit, to the mind and its aims, to its broken methods, its constructions of will and opinion and emotion dependent on egoism, division and ignorance, he cannot rise beyond this death to that immortality which the Upanishad promises to the seeker, that Brahman we have to know and seek after, and not this which men here adore and pursue. The conception which we have so far been striving to form is that of the essence only of the supramental life which the divine soul possesses securely in the being of Satchidananda, but which the human soul has to manifest in this body of Satchidananda formed here into the mold of a mental and physical living. The possession of the infinite cannot come except by an ascent to those supramental planes, nor the knowledge of it except by an inert submission of mind to the descending messages of the truth-conscious reality. But it cannot, because behind this dividing action is the saving knowledge of the supramental which knows every whole, every atom to be only a concentration of all force, of all consciousness, of all being into phenomenal forms of itself. Whence then does the limiting avidya, the fall of mind from supermind and the consequent idea of real division originally proceed? Exactly from what perversion of the supramental functioning? It proceeds from the individualized soul viewing everything from its own standpoint and excluding all others. It proceeds, that is to say, by an exclusive concentration of consciousness, an exclusive self-identification of the soul with a particular temporal and spatial action which is only a part of its own play of being. It starts from the soul's ignoring the fact that all others are also itself, all other action its own action, and all other states of being and consciousness equally its own as well as the action of the one particular moment in time and one particular standing point in space and the one particular form it presently occupies. For there is still the veil created by avidya between the mental and supramental action. An image of the truth gets through, not the truth itself. Afterwards we have to emerge from this error into the supramental play or the truth of Maya, where the each and the all coexist in the inseparable unity of the one truth and the multiple symbol. A truth of conscious being supports these forms and expresses itself in them, and the knowledge corresponding to the truth thus expressed reigns as a supramental truth consciousness organizing real ideas in a perfect harmony before they are cast into the mental vital material mold. But such a mind would be something quite different from the definition of mind as we know it. It would be something beyond mentality, it would be the supramental truth. An infinite mind constituted in the terms of mentality as we know it could only create an infinite chaos, a vast clash of chance, accident, vicissitude wandering towards an indeterminate end after which it would be always tentatively groping and aspiring. An infinite, omniscient, omnipotent mind would not be mind at all, but supramental knowledge. Mind is essentially a reflective mirror which receives presentations or images of a pre-existent truth or fact, either external to or at least vaster than itself. That status of knowledge may be summed up as a supramental realization which is prepared by mental representations through various mental principles in us and once attained again reflects itself more perfectly in all the members of the being. For there is an intuitive mind in man which serves as a recipient and channel for these instreamings from a supramental faculty. But the action of intuition and inspiration in us is imperfect in kind as well as intermittent in action. Ordinarily, it comes in response to a claim from the laboring and struggling heart or intellect, and, even before its givings enter the conscious mind, they are already affected by the thought or aspiration which went up to meet them, are no longer pure but altered to the needs of the heart or intellect, and after they enter the conscious mind, they are immediately seized upon by the intellectual understanding and dissipated or broken up so as to fit in with our imperfect intellectual knowledge, or by the heart and remolded to suit our blind or half-blind emotional longings and preferences, or even by the lower cravings and distorted to the vehement uses of our hungers and passions. In the first place we have seen that intellectual thought is in itself inadequate and is not the highest thinking. The highest is that which comes through the intuitive mind and from the supramental faculty. So long as we are dominated by the intellectual habit and by the lower workings, the intuitive mind can only send its messages to us subconsciously and subject to a distortion more or less entire before it reaches the conscious mind, or if it works consciously, then only with an inadequate rarity and a great imperfection in its functioning. In the extension, the divine soul will be aware of the three grades of the supramental existence, not as we are mentally compelled to regard them, not as grades, but as a triune fact of the self-manifestation of Satchidananda. If the defect of our mentality, if its need of exclusive concentration compels it to dwell on any one of these aspects of self-knowledge to the exclusion of the others, if a realization imperfect as well as exclusive moves us always to bring in a human element of error into the very truth itself and of conflict and mutual negation into the all-comprehending unity, yet to a divine supramental being, by the essential character of the supermind which is a comprehending oneness and infinite totality, they must present themselves as a triple and indeed a triune realization. So must the truth consciousness or supermind affect the relations of soul with soul by forces, faculties, functionings proper to supramental being, otherwise there would be no play of differentiation. Let us realize then that a vibration of sound on the material plane presupposes a corresponding vibration on the vital without which it could not have come into play. That again presupposes a corresponding originative vibration on the mental presupposes a corresponding originative vibration on the supramental at the very root of things. But a mental vibration implies thought and perception, and a supramental vibration implies a supreme vision and discernment. But a mental vibration implies thought and perception, and a supramental vibration implies a supreme vision and discernment. The herds and the waters are the two principal images of the Veda. The former are the trooping rays of the divine sun, herds of the luminous consciousness, the waters are the outpouring of the luminous movement and impulse of the divine or supramental existence. Swar, the world of divine solar light to which we have to ascend and which is revealed by the release of the luminous herds from the nether cave and the consequent uprising of the divine sun. This verse is addressed to Indra, the power of divine mind, through whom comes the illumination of the supramental truth. By the advancing chariots of this giver of light we conquer our divine possessions. Now the third state, the free mental being, is to be perfected by a richly varied and luminous play of thought and word ending in the manifestation of the highest reach of the mental realms, the power of the supramental light in the mentality. There begins the manifestation of the intuitive and inspired mind. Thirdly, life is at war with body, mind at war with the life and the body, each trying to subject the others to its own law. Only the supramental can find the law of immortal harmony which shall reconcile this discord of our mortality. Unless therefore the race is to fall by the wayside and leave the victory to other and new creations of the eager travailing mother, it must aspire to this ascent, conducted indeed through love, mental illumination and the vital urge to possession and self-giving, but leading beyond to the supramental unity which transcends and fulfills them, in the founding of human life upon the supramental realization of conscious unity with all in our being and in all its members. Humanity must seek its final good and salvation. Unless therefore the race is to fall by the wayside and leave the victory to other and new creations of the eager travailing mother, it must aspire to this ascent, conducted indeed through love, mental illumination and the vital urge to possession and self-giving, but leading beyond to the supramental unity which transcends and fulfills them, in the founding of human life upon the supramental realization of conscious unity with all in our being and in all its members. Humanity must seek its final good and salvation. The two shining horses of Indra, identical probably with the two cows of light of the first verse, they are the two vision powers of the supramental truth consciousness, right hand and left hand, probably direct truth discernment and intuition. It is fairly evident that the Anaya's rishis are here the radiant lustres of the divine Agni which are born in heaven, therefore of the divine flame and not of any physical fire. They become equipped with the 9 rays of the light and the 10, become most agiras, that is to say most full of the blazing radiance of Agni, the divine flame, and are therefore able to release the imprisoned light and force and create the supramental knowledge. Even if this interpretation of the symbolism is not accepted, yet that there is a symbolism must be admitted. For Agni himself has been described to us as having the seer will, Kavakratu, the force of action which works according to the inspired or supramental knowledge, Sravas, for it is that knowledge and not intellectuality which is meant by the word Kavi. We now begin to have reason for concluding that the flame, which is only another aspect of light, is the Vedic symbol for the force of the divine consciousness, of the supramental truth. In another passage, 6.11.3, we have mention of the seer most illumined of the Angiraces, Vapihoa Jiras Vipra, where the reference is not at all clear. The mother is earth, our physical being, the other world is the supramental existence, the vital and emotional being is the world in between. All here in the mental is a growing light, consciousness and life, all there in the supramental is an infinite life, light and consciousness. I.36.8, human beings, Manua, slaying the Kavara have crossed beyond both earth and heaven and made the wide world for their dwelling place. Gnanto vitram ataran rodas apa uru kaya kakraya, that this supracelestial wideness, this illimitable light is a supramental heaven, the heaven of the supramental truth, of the immortal beatitude, and that the light which is its substance and constituent reality, is the light of truth. But there is also the absolute Aryan who would conquer and pass beyond these states to the transcendental harmony of them all. It is the supramental truth that is the instrument of this great inner transfiguration. And that perfection must be attained on all our levels, in the wideness of earth, our physical being and consciousness, in the full force of vital speed and action and enjoyment and nervous vibration, typified as the horse which must be brought forward to upbear our endeavor, in the perfect gladness of the heart of emotion and a brilliant heat and clarity of the mind throughout our intellectual and psychical being, in the coming of the supramental light, the dawn and the sun and the shining mother of the herds, to transform all our existence, for so comes to us the possession of the truth, by the truth the admirable surge of the bliss, in the bliss infinite consciousness of absolute being. This great achievement must be done here in this mortal world, in this limited body, for if we do it, we arrive at our true existence and are no longer bound down to our phenomenal becoming. But if here we find it not, great is the loss and perdition, for we remain continually immersed in the phenomenal life of the mind and body and do not rise above it into the true supramental existence. Nor, if we miss it here, will death give it to us by our passage to another and less difficult world. The second is the Lord of all this dual action who is beyond it. He is the truth of Brahman and not in any way a falsehood or misrepresentation, but the truth of it as attained by us in our eternal supramental being. In him are the absolutes of all that here we experience in partial figures. If our purified mind were to reflect this secondary poise of supermind, our soul could support and occupy its individual existence and yet even there realize itself as the one that has become all, inhabits all, contains all, enjoying even in its particular modification its unity with God and its fellows. In no other circumstance of the supramental existence would there be any characteristic change. The only change would be this play of the one that has manifested its multiplicity and of the many that are still one, with all that is necessary to maintain and conduct the play. And it is a very complex composite with many layers. There is a layer of physical, a layer of nervous, a layer of mental, even a final stratum of supramental personality, and within these layers themselves there are strata within each stratum. So too the sense will be changed by the visitings of the sense behind the sense, and the whole sense view of the universe itself will be altered so that the vital, mental and supramental will become visible to the sense with the physical only as their last, outermost and smallest result. But this is the natural conclusion even apart from spiritual experience, from the nature of the supramental principle. For it is at its highest an eternal knowledge, will, bliss and conscious being, and it is more reasonable to conclude that it is eternally conscious, though we are not conscious of it, and the source of the universe, than that it is eternally inconscient and only becomes conscient in time as a result of the universe. But all this experience is only the vestibule to that suprasensuous, supramental realization of the transcendent who is beyond all his aspects, and the final summit of knowledge can only be attained by entering into the superconscient and then merging all other experience into a supernal unity with the ineffable. When we arrive at this state, all our being and consciousness being concentrated, the necessity of concentration in the idea ceases. For there in that supramental state the whole position of things is reversed. The body of man depends upon this physical principle, and if the outflowing of life is the result of mind emerging, expanding, elevating itself in search of its own truth in the largeness of the supramental existence, yet it seems also to be conditioned by this case of body and by this foundation of matter. For the inner and inherent law of the one and whole, which is necessarily a harmony, governs the outer and processive laws of the parts or forms which appear to be in collision, and to the supramental vision this greater and profounder truth of harmony is always present. By the consequent transformation of the values of our lower existence into the right and truth of that higher being which is at present superconscient to it, we shall be able eventually to rise from the mental to the supramental level. We shall realize progressively in ourselves and the world the fourth status of life. This soul-conquering thought is certainly the same as that seven-headed thought which was born from the truth and discovered by Ayasya the companion of the Navaguas, for by it, we are told, Ayasya becoming universal, embracing the births in all the worlds, brought into being a fourth world or fourfold world, which must be the supramental beyond the three lower sessions, Dyaus, Antariksha and Prithivi, that wide world which, according to Kanwa son of Gora, men reach or create by crossing beyond. The Turodasi after killing Vritra. The divine is inalienable self-bliss and inviolable all-bliss, the human is sensation of mind and body seeking for delight, but finding only pleasure, indifference and pain. The divine is supramental knowledge comprehending all and supramental will affecting all. The human is ignorance reaching out to knowledge by the comprehension of things in parts and parcels which it has to join clumsily together, and it is incapacity attempting to acquire force and will through a gradual extension of power corresponding to its gradual extension of knowledge, and this extension it can only bring about by a partial and parcelled exercise of will corresponding to the partial and parcelled method of its knowledge. If it were easily possible to elevate ourselves to the supramental plane and, dwelling securely there, realize world and being, consciousness and action, outgoing and incoming of conscious experience by the power and in the manner of the divine supramental faculties, this realization would offer no essential difficulties. If it were easily possible to elevate ourselves to the supramental plane and, dwelling securely there, realize world and being, consciousness and action, outgoing and incoming of conscious experience by the power and in the manner of the divine supramental faculties, this realization would offer no essential difficulties. If it were easily possible to elevate ourselves to the supramental plane and, dwelling securely there, realize world and being, consciousness and action, outgoing and incoming of conscious experience by the power and in the manner of the divine supramental faculties, this realization would offer no essential difficulties. But man is a mental and not yet a supramental being. It is by the mind therefore that he has to aim at knowledge and realize his being, with whatever help he can get from the supramental planes. It is by the mind therefore that he has to aim at knowledge and realize his being, with whatever help he can get from the supramental planes. This character of our actually realized being and therefore of our yoga imposes on us certain limitations and primary difficulties which can only be overcome by divine help or an arduous practice, and in reality only by the combination of both these aids. It is described as the true, the right, the vast, as the luminous supramental heaven of Swar, vast Swar, the great truth, concealed beyond our heaven and our earth, and Asiya, the sun, that truth which dwells lost in the darkness, withheld from us in the secret cave of the subconscient. This hidden truth is the vast because it dwells free and manifest only on the supramental plane where existence, will, knowledge, joy move in a rapturous and boundless infinity and are not limited and hedged as in this many-walled existence of the mind, life and body which form the lower being. That is the wideness of the higher being to which we have to ascend, breaking beyond the two enclosing firmaments of the mental and physical. It is described as a divine existence free and large in its unbounded range. It is a wideness where there is no obstacle nor any siege of limitation. It is the fear-free pasture of the luminous herds of the sun. It is the seat and house of the truth, the own home of the gods, the solar world, the true light where there is no fear for the soul, no possibility of any wound to the large and equal bliss of its existence. This supramental vastness is also the fundamental truth of being, Satyam, out of which its active truth wells out naturally and without strife of effort into a perfect and faultless movement, because there is upon those heights no division, no gulf between consciousness and force, no divorce of knowledge and will, no disharmonizing of our being and its action. Everything there is the straight and there is no least possibility of crookedness. This supramental vastness is also the fundamental truth of being, Satyam, out of which its active truth wells out naturally and without strife of effort into a perfect and faultless movement, because there is upon those heights no division, no gulf between consciousness and force, no divorce of knowledge and will, no disharmonizing of our being and its action. Everything there is the straight and there is no least possibility of crookedness. Therefore this supramental plane of vastness and true being is also Ritam, the true activity of things. It is a supreme truth of zero movement, action, manifestation, an infallible truth of will and heart and knowledge, a perfect truth of thought and word and emotion. It is the spontaneous right, the free law, the original divine order of things, untouched by the facades of the divided and separative consciousness. Then appear the straight undeviating paths of the truth, the road and ford of heaven, the way of going of the gods and of the fathers. For by this path where no violence is done to the divine workings, straight, thornless, happy, easy to tread once our feet are set upon it, and the manifested divinities are our guard, the luminous fathers ascended by the power of the word, by the power of the wine, by the power of the sacrifice into the fearless light, and stood upon the wide and open levels of the supramental existence. So must man, their posterity, exchange the crooked movements of the separative consciousness for the straight things of the truth-conscious mind. Therefore his complete perfection is through the ascent to supermind and the conquest of the physical also by the supramental substance, so that he will be able to command a diviner physical life and conquer death in a divine body. So it should rationally be, for the uninterrupted series of the principles of our being and their close mutual connection is too evident for it to be possible that one of them should be condemned and cut off while the others are capable of a divine liberation. The ascent of man from the physical to the supramental must open out the possibility of a corresponding ascent in the grades of substance to that ideal or causal body which is proper to our supramental being, and the conquest of the lower principles by supermind and its liberation of them into a divine life and a divine mentality must also render possible a conquest of our physical limitations by the power and principle of supramental substance. The ascent of man from the physical to the supramental must open out the possibility of a corresponding ascent in the grades of substance to that ideal or causal body which is proper to our supramental being, and the conquest of the lower principles by supermind and its liberation of them into a divine life and a divine mentality must also render possible a conquest of our physical limitations by the power and principle of supramental substance. And this means the evolution not only of an untrammeled consciousness, a mind and sense not shut up in the walls of the physical ego or limited to the poor basis of knowledge given by the physical organs of sense, but a life power liberated more and more from its mortal limitations, a physical life fit for a divine inhabitant and, in the sense not of attachment or of restriction to our present corporeal frame but an exceeding of the law of the physical body, the conquest of death, an earthly immortality. But if on the contrary it is immortal and infinite spirit which has veiled itself in matter and is emerging, the development of a liberated supramental being who shall impose in mind, life and matter a higher law than that of limitation and division, is the inevitable conclusion from the nature of cosmic existence. If, in other words, it is not merely a mental being who is hidden in the forms of the universe, but the infinite being, knowledge, will which emerges out of matter first as life, then as mind, with the rest of it still unrevealed, then the emergence of consciousness out of the apparently inconscient must have another and completer term, the appearance of a supramental spiritual being who shall impose on his mental, vital, bodily workings a higher law than that of the dividing mind is no longer impossible. On the contrary, it is the natural and inevitable conclusion of the nature of cosmic existence. Such a supramental being would, as we have seen, liberate the mind from the knot of its divided existence and use the individualization of mind as merely a useful subordinate action of the all-embracing supermind. And he would liberate the life from the knot of its divided existence and use the individualization of life as merely a useful subordinate action of the one conscious force fulfilling its being and joy in a diversified unity. And if man be the inhabitant of terrestrial existence through whom that transformation of the mental into the supramental can at last be operated, is it not possible that he may develop, as well as a divine mind and a divine life, also a divine body? Swarajya and Samrajya, perfect empire within and without, rule of our inner being and mastery of our environment and circumstances, was the ideal of the Vedic sages, attainable only by ascending beyond our mortal mentality to the luminous truth of our being, the supramental infinities on the spiritual plane our existence. By such meditation the mind may be brought to a favorable state of predisposition in which, by the rending or withdrawing of the veil, the supramental vision may flood the mentality and change entirely all our seeing. This unity embracing all mind, life and matter in the light of a supramental truth and the pulse of a spiritual bliss will be to us our internal fulfillment of the divine in a complete cosmic consciousness. But rightly to know and express the highest is not easy for man the mental being because the highest truth and therefore the highest modes of existence are supramental. They repose on the essential unity of what seem to the intellect and mind and are to our mental experience of the world opposite poles of existence and idea and therefore irreconcilable opposites and contradictions, but to the supramental experience are complementary aspects of the same truth. They repose on the essential unity of what seem to the intellect and mind and are to our mental experience of the world opposite poles of existence and idea and therefore irreconcilable opposites and contradictions, but to the supramental experience are complementary aspects of the same truth. But the timeless self-knowledge of this eternal is beyond mind, it is a supramental knowledge superconscient to us and only to be acquired by the stilling or transcending of the temporal activity of our conscious mind. But in reality we shall find, he is always the same eternal who is forever stable and self-possessed in his supramental knowledge, and what he seizes on is also forever stable and eternal, for it is himself that he is mentally experiencing in the succession of time. Here too are many planes, the lows converging upon and melting into the worlds below, the highest at the heights of the mind power into the worlds of a more spiritual existence. These highest worlds are therefore supramental. They belong to the principle of supermind, the free, spiritual or divine intelligence or gnosis, and to the triple spiritual principle of Satchidananda. But this causal body is, as we may say, little developed in the majority of men, and to live in it or to ascend to the supramental planes, as distinguished from corresponding subplanes in the mental being, or still more to dwell consciously upon them, is the most difficult thing of all for the human being. The distinction between the knowledge and the ignorance begins with the hymns of the Rig Veda, where the latter means the absence of what is called the divine eye of perception, which gives us the sight of the supramental truth, and it is called the non-perceiving in our consciousness as opposed to the perceiving conscious vision and knowledge. The knowledge is that which tending and attaining to the supramental faculty seizes the unity, the essence, the self-law, and deals with the multiplicity of things out of that light and plenitude, in some sort as does the divine himself from the highest height whence he embraces the world. Thus it harmonizes for us all the oppositions, divisions, contrarieties of existence, and shows us in them the one and the infinite. Uplifted into this supramental light, pain and pleasure and indifference begin to be converted into joy of the one self-existent delight, strength and weakness, success and failure into powers of the one self-effective force and will, truth and error, knowledge and ignorance into light of the one infinite self-awareness and universal knowledge, increase of being and diminution of being, limitation and the overcoming of limitation into waves of the one self-realizing conscious existence. Thus identified with Satchidananda in the universal self-existence as the spiritualized mental being, he may then ascend beyond to the supramental plane of the pure spiritual existence. It is the latter method, the stages of which we may now attempt to trace for the seeker by the path of knowledge. Really, these three are only subordinate powers of the divine quaternion. Mind is a subordinate power of supermind which takes its stand in the standpoint of division, actually forgetful here of the oneness behind, though able to return to it by re-illumination from the supramental. Life is similarly a subordinate power of the energy aspect of Satchidananda. It is force working out form and the play of conscious energy from the standpoint of division created by mind. Matter is the form of substance of being which the existence of Satchidananda assumes when its subject. Thus the dawns come with a constant alternation, thrice 10, the mystic number of our mentality making the month, till someday there shall break out upon us the wondrous experience of our forefathers in a long bygone age of humanity, when the dawns succeeded each other without the intervention of any night, when they came to the sun as to a lover and circled round him, not returning again and again in his front as a precursor of his periodical visitations. That shall be when the supramental consciousness shines out fulfilled in the mentality, and we shall possess the ye-long day enjoyed by the gods on the summit of the eternal mountain. That is the real being, Lord and Creator, who has descended into that which we call the inconscient and constitutes and directs its subconscient existence by his supramental will and knowledge, has ascended out of the inconscient and dwells in the mental being constituting and directing its subliminal existence by the same will and knowledge, has cast up out of the subliminal our surface existence and dwells secretly in it, overseeing with the same supreme light and mastery its stumbling and groping movements. But the Absolute, obviously, finds no difficulty in world manifestation and no difficulty either in a simultaneous transcendence of world manifestation. The difficulty exists only for our mental limitations, which prevent us from grasping the supramental rationality of the coexistence of the infinite and the finite, or seizing the nodus of the unconditioned with the conditioned. We admit the creative mind, but see that it is only a half-luminous shadow of the divine supermind and can only arrive at its own perfection by admitting the light of the higher knowledge and transforming its own more ignorant and conflicting values and powers into the harmonious values and divinely effective powers of the supramental truth. We admit life as the field of our activities and the mold into which we have to pour even the divine existence to which we aspire, so that the purpose of the cosmic existence may be accomplished. But we see that life cannot be perfected or find its true movement until it knows itself as an inferior energy of the divine and elevates and subtilizes its action into a free channel for the outpourings of the superior divine nature. It is supposed that there are states of being which can only be gained in trance, that especially is to be desired in which all action of awareness is abolished and there is no consciousness at all except the pure supramental immersion in immobile, timeless and infinite being. If we examine the phraseology of the old books, we shall find that the waking state is the consciousness of the material universe which we normally possess in this embodied existence dominated by the physical mind. The dream state is a consciousness corresponding to the subtler life plane and mind plane behind, which to us, even when we get intimations of them, have not the same concrete reality as the things of the physical existence. The sleep state is a consciousness corresponding to the supramental plane proper to the gnosis, which is beyond our experience because our causal body or envelope of gnosis is not developed in us, its faculties not active, and therefore we are in relation to that plane in a condition of dreamless sleep. Normally indeed the human mind cannot be awake even with the inner waking of trance on the supramental levels, but this disability can be overcome. Awake on these levels the soul becomes master of the ranges of Gnostic thought, Gnostic will, Gnostic delight, and if it can do this in samadhi, it may carry its memory of experience and its power of experience over into the waking state. A heightening then of our force of consciousness, now only mental, until it not only admits a new, a supramental or spiritual principle, but rises into that and lives in it, is the whole meaning of what we have called the divine life, or rather of the growth out of the ordinary, the half-animal humanity into the divine being and the divine life. For in this superconscient are included both the higher planes of our mental being and also all the planes of our supramental and pure spiritual being. Into that we have to heighten our force of consciousness, so that we may dwell on the superior planes of mind into which the supermind and the spirit can throw themselves and can make themselves initially manifest and govern from them our lower being. Afterwards, when our humanity is ready for the yet sublimer ascent, we may get beyond the mental into the supramental itself and the pure spiritual. Into that we have to heighten our force of consciousness, so that we may dwell on the superior planes of mind into which the supermind and the spirit can throw themselves and can make themselves initially manifest and govern from them our lower being. Afterwards, when our humanity is ready for the yet sublimer ascent, we may get beyond the mental into the supramental itself and the pure spiritual. It is quite possible indeed, without actually ascending into the superconscient mental planes or, at least, without actually living on them, to get rid to a certain extent of our constitutional ignorance, to become aware of ourselves as spiritual beings and to spiritualize, though very imperfectly, our normal human life. Secondly, there are fuller, greater powers belonging to the supramental planes which are the very powers of the divine in his spiritual and supramentally ideative being. The central will implicit in life must be no longer the vital will in the life and the body, but the spiritual will which is now only disclosed to us weakened and disguised in the mental idea, but which is in its own nature supramental and the supramental power and truth of which we have somehow to discover. Neither can it be found in the wider rounds of the mental being, for that also is instrumental and tends towards something else beyond it, whose power indeed works in it, but whose larger truth is superconscient to its present intelligence, supramental. The perfection of man lies in the unfolding of the ever-perfect spirit. He would be able to develop to the reflection of a higher knowledge and joy than the mental, receive more fully the inspirations and intuitions of the supramental being and form his perfected mental existence in their light. The Upanishad expresses this truth when it says that the heavens so attained are those to which man is lifted by the rays of the sun, by which it means the diffused, separated, though intense beams of the supramental truth consciousness, and from these it has to return. That is, in the ordinary workings of the life plane and the material plane, because they are unilluminated, full of ignorance and defect, the law of our divine and infinite being is impaired or spoiled, works under restrictions and with perversions, it manifests fully, steadfastly and faultlessly only when the ideal, supramental truth plane is upheld in us by the pure wideness and harmony of Varuna and Mitra and takes up the vital and the physical consciousness into its power and light. This is the basis, and when it is achieved, then only can we progress to the normality of the supramental ideation, for that is the play of the supreme light and, though we may receive or reflect it even before we rise into the gnosis, we cannot command or wholly possess it until we become the being of the supreme light, until our consciousness is transformed into that consciousness, for according to the nature of our consciousness will be the normal strain of our ideation. The Vijnana takes up the will and puts it first into harmony and then into oneness with the truth of the supramental knowledge. In this knowledge the idea in the individual is one with the idea in the universal, because both are brought back to the truth of the supreme knowledge and will. Immense ranges of powers, influences, phenomena descend upon us from the supramental, the mental, the vital worlds, and of these only a part, a selection, as it were, can stage and realize themselves in the order of the physical world, the rest awaiting their time and proper circumstance for revelation in physical term and form, for their play in the terrestrial evolution. It is the pressure of the mind world which evolves and develops mind here and in us, finds a leverage for self-uplifting and expansion so that we may hope to enlarge continually and even to escape from the prison of our physical mentality. It is the pressure of the supramental and spiritual worlds which is preparing to develop here the manifest power of the spirit and by it open even the being on the physical plane, ihaiva, to the freedom and infinity of the superconscient divine and liberate from the apparent inconscience, which was our starting point, the all-conscient Godhead concealed in us. Thus, having laid down a basis of material being, material forms, forces, existences in which it seems to be lying inconscient or, in reality, as we now know, always working subconsciously, it is still able to manifest life, to manifest mind and mental beings in a material world and must therefore be able to manifest their supermind also and supramental beings. This is the general principle of the evolution. And that is the true aim of ethics, discipline and ascesis, to lessen and tame, purify and prepare to be fit instruments the vital and physical and lower mental life so that they may be transformed into notes of the higher mental and eventually the supramental, but not to mutilate and destroy them. This downward eye of knowledge and will with a view to an all-round heightening is his way from the beginning. The spiritual man who can guide human life towards its perfection is typified in the ancient Indian idea of the rishi, who living the life of man has found the word of the superintellectual, supramental, spiritual truth. He has risen above these lower limitations and can view all things from above, but also he is in sympathy with their effort and can view them from within. He has the complete knowledge and the higher knowledge. This ideation, however, is not in its character intellectual ideation, not what we call the reason, for that is mental in its methods, mental in its basis, mental in its acquisitions, but the ideation of the gnosis is supramental in its methods, its basis, its yield of thought light. In fact, we must accept the ancient idea that man has within him not only the physical soul or purusha with its appropriate nature, but a vital, a mental, a supramental, a spiritual, and either the whole or the greater part of them is concealed in his subliminal and his superconscient being. Nor is this perfected mental being the last human potentiality. There is also the possibility of a supramental being, which will be the beginning of a new spiritual humanity and by which there can come the full manifestation of the. For as a long succession of assumptions of lower forms was necessary to bring about our present human birth, so a long series of assumptions of the human form is necessary to bring about the full mental, supramental and spiritual evolution of the human being. But this is not to be developed by a series of immediate transmigrations from one human body to another human body. It is brought about by a constant resort to the higher planes, the mental, the supramental, the spiritual, in which these graded poises of the being have successively their natural home and their free and characteristic play. Already he is spirit and supermind as well as mind, life and body, spirit which has arrived at the manifestation of its mental being in the physical life and must arrive here at the manifestation of the supramental and the spiritual being. The object of human life is not therefore the growth of a totally physical being into a totally spiritual existence and its resulting promotion to higher worlds, but the descent of the spirit upon earth and the raising of a characteristically physical life to its utmost spiritual power. But we have come to the conclusion that man is not destined to remain limited by his mental being. He can develop in himself the supramental being and by that manifest the power of the spirit in his human existence. To transcend it he has in the universality to rise to the supramental and spiritual, to be one with the supramental soul of cosmos, the universal spirit. This inner awareness is his intuition of his supramental and spiritual being. The mental purusha can at any time involve himself again in the superficial action from which he has drawn back, live for a while entirely identified with the mechanism of mind, life and body and absorbedly repeat its recurrent normal action. There is even, it was supposed in ancient times, a transition to supramental worlds from which a return to earthly consciousness was either not possible or not obligatory. Sometimes he finds himself using it, but as a channel or instrument, it comes to him from above. It is clear then that it is supramental, a power of the spirit greater than mental being which he already knows himself to be at the summit and in the secret core of his conscious being. To be active master of the nature he must evidently rise to some higher supramental poise where there is possible not only a passive, but an active identity with the controlling spirit. And in the mind it is evidently by the buddhi, the intelligence and the will of the intelligence that the human being is intended to do whatever work is not done for him by the physical or nervous nature as in the plant and the animal. Pending the evolution of any higher supramental power the intelligent will must be our main force for effectuation and to purify it becomes a very primary necessity. But this ananda can only come at all when we can get at and reflect in our members the hidden spiritual being, and its fullness can only be had when we climb to the supramental ranges. Meanwhile there is a just and permissible, a quite legitimate human enjoyment of these things, which is, to speak in the language of Indian psychology, predominantly sattvic in its nature. This control can be exercised perfectly, however, only from the supramental level, for it is there that the true effective idea and will reside and the mental thought mind, even spiritualized, is only a limited, though it may be made a very powerful deputy. The selective process necessary to action is left principally to the buddhi and, when the buddhi has been overpassed, to the spirit in the supramental will, knowledge and ananda. The receptive sensational mind is the nervous mental basis of the affections. It receives mentally the impacts of things and gives to them the responses of mental pleasure and pain, which are the starting point of the duality of emotional liking and disliking. Its right form of action is a pure dynamic force of strength, courage, temperamental power, not acting for itself or in obedience to the lower members, but as an impartial channel for the dictates of the pure intelligence and will or the supramental Purusha. When we have got rid of these deformations and cleared the mentality for these true forms of action, the lower mentality is purified and ready for perfection. The characteristic action of the spirit in its unity, in its global regard on cosmos, is supramental. The other, the mental action, is at best a secondary and a derivative functioning. A second step that can be taken is to rise from this intenser living into a use of our faculties and habits of consciousness in which they will become more and more a reflected secondary functioning of the supramental powers of spirit. We have already such an action fitful, partial and irregular, though more luminous in the most developed human types, but always dispersed, untrained and clogged with and encrusted in our normal mentality. Intuition is the name which we commonly give to the secondary activity of the supramental power in the lower hemisphere of mind, life and body. Whether to the supreme mental height or beyond the supramental border, the transition from our present limited being must be in the nature of a new manifestation and a conversion. Physically, the animal form may or may not have grown out of the vegetable, the body and the life of man out of the body and life of the animal, but that body would have still housed an animal and not a human mind if a new soul belonging to a higher plane had not leaned down to aid in its evolution and descended, we might say, or phenomenally manifested within it. But here the higher self, belonging to the supramental sphere, is the divine soul, and only by the action of the divine himself leaning down to the human aspiration could such a great conversion be effected. In order that this spiritual being may not be something vague and indefinable or else but imperfectly realized and dependent on the mental support and the mental limitations, it seeks to go beyond mind to the supramental knowledge, will, sense, feeling, intuition, dynamic initiation of vital and physical action, all that makes the native working of the spiritual being. Moreover, since human life is still accepted as a self-expression of the realized divine in man, there must be an action of the entire divine nature in our life, and this brings in the need of the supramental conversion, which substitutes the native action of spiritual being for the imperfect action of the superficial nature and spiritualizes and transfigures its mental, vital and physical parts by the spiritual ideality. These three elements, a union with the supreme divine, unity with the universal self, and a supramental life action from this transcendent origin and through this universality, but still with the individual as the sole channel and natural instrument, constitute the essence of the integral divine perfection of the human being. Man is the instrument of this conversion by which mind shall discover the supramental being of which it is the broken and deflected radiation, deliver into freedom the power of which life is the outward stir, realize in a greater sight and being the spirit of which matter is a mutable body. To grow into the Godhead which in his progressive becoming is growing within him, is his destiny. Light, knowledge, supramental gnosis is the power that can effect the conversion, a light that is in its force the primal, original, divine power and the order of a divine harmony. To be the divine and universal individual living in the light of the supramental gnosis is therefore the foundation of the spiritual perfection. But even this is not all that man is or can be. He has in him the power to evolve and release a still greater ideal energy which in its turn escapes out of the restrictions of the mental formula of his nature and discloses the supramental form, the ideal power of a spiritual being. In yoga we have to travel beyond the physical nature and the superficial man and to discover the workings of the whole nature of the real man. If we look at her on her most external side where she seems the opposite of Purusha, she is Prakriti, an inert and mechanical self-driven operation, inconscient or conscient only by the light of Purusha, elevated by various degrees, vital, mental, supramental, of his soul illumination of her workings. If we look at her on her other internal side where she moves nearer to unity with Purusha, she is Maya, will of being and becoming or of cessation from being and becoming with all their results, apparent to the consciousness, of involution and evolution, existing and non-existing, self-concealment of spirit and self-discovery of spirit. The spirit involved in material energy is there with all its powers, life, mind and a greater supramental power are involved in matter. But what do we mean when we say that they are involved? And do we mean that all these things are quite different energies cut off from each other by an essential separateness, but rolled up together in an interaction? Or do we mean that there is only one being with its one energy, varying shades of the light of its power differentiated in the spectrum of nature? Mind too might only be an inferior scale and formulation derived from a much greater and supramental consciousness, and that consciousness too with its greater light and will a characteristic originating power of spiritual being. The power which secret in all things, in mind, in life, in matter, in the plant and the metal and the atom assures constantly by its inevitable action the idea and harmony of the universe. The crux of the difficulty lies in the possession by the spirit of the power and nature of supermind which maintains unity in diversity, has the experience of the infinite in the finite, of the transcendent and universal consciousness in the individual, of the one all-harmonizing will in a myriad diverse willings, of the reconciling supramental knowledge behind all the conflicting variations of mind, of the immortal life in the apparent mortality of our existence, of the inalienable self-existent delight in all the experience that to the mind takes on the tints of pain, pleasure and neutral indifference. The full possession of the spiritual and the supramental nature depends on the opening up of these higher gradations or planes of conscious being in man in his physical existence. In other words, a perfection has to be aimed at which amounts to the elevation of the mental into the full spiritual and supramental nature. Therefore this integral yoga of knowledge, love and works has to be extended into a yoga of spiritual and Gnostic self-perfection. The universal spirit contains and views all these gradations simultaneously, and the individual also inwardly has the same power of being. It is, that is to say, at once an infinite spiritual being of existence, consciousness and bliss, a soul dealing with the separations of life, mind and body, and a supramental being linking these two apparent oppositions of existence by the experience at once of oneness and diversity. When the transition to supermind takes place, the powers of the buddhi do not perish, but have all to be converted to their supramental values. But the consideration of the supermind and the conversion of the buddhi belongs to the question of the higher siddhi or divine perfection. The flowering of the mental and vital ego or at most its subservience to the larger ego of the community is his cultural ideal. Here this ego is regarded as the chief obstacle to soul perfection and its place is proposed to be taken not by the concrete communal ego, but by something inward, abstract, transcendental, some supramental, supraphysical reality. His own type is that of the rajasic, kinetic, pragmatic, active man, and thought for him turns always to action and has little value except for the sake of action or as a satisfaction of mental activity. Here the type proposed for admiration is the self-possessing sattvic man for whom calm thought, knowledge and the inner life are the things of the greatest importance and action is chiefly of consequence for its effects on the growth of the inner being. Nevertheless the result of this movement cannot be complete, because the heart is not the highest center of our being, is not supramental nor directly moved from the supramental sources. An intuitive thought and action directed from it may be very luminous and intense but is likely to be limited, even narrow in its intensity, mixed with a lower emotional action and at the best excited and troubled, rendered unbalanced or exaggerated by a miraculous or abnormal character in its action or at least in many of its accompaniments which is injurious to the harmonized perfection of the being. If we can feel ourselves thinking no longer with the brain but from above and outside the head in the subtle body, that is a sure physical sign of a release from the limitations of the physical mind, and though this will not be complete at once nor of itself bring the supramental action, for the subtle body is mental and not supramental, still it is a subtle and pure mentality and makes an easier communication with the supramental centers. The problem of this conversion resolves itself at first into a passage through a mediary status and by the help of the one power already at work in the human mind which we can recognize as something supramental in its nature or at least in its origin, the faculty of intuition, a power of which we can feel the presence and the workings and are impressed, when it acts, by its superior efficiency, light, direct inspiration and force, but cannot understand or analyze it as we understand or analyze the workings of our reason. At first it might seem the straight and right way to silence the mind altogether, to silence the intellect, the mental and personal will, the desire mind and the mind of emotion and sensation, and to allow in that perfect silence the self, the spirit, the divine to disclose himself and leave him to illuminate the being by the supramental light and power and ananda. And this is indeed a great and powerful discipline. Nevertheless, it is not the fact that by this method the supramental light will immediately replace the lower mind and reflective reason. The will of the mind and life is a stumbling about in search of right force, right tapas which can wholly be attained in its true and complete light and direction only by oneness with the spiritual and supramental being. The supramental nature on the contrary is just, harmonious and one, will acknowledge their only light of the spirit and power of the spirit, the power effecting the light illumining the power. Is it to be always through the mind only and on the mind plane or in some greater supramental formulation which is more proper to a divine action and which will take up and replace the mental functions? The divine will and wisdom organizing the action of the infinite consciousness and determining all things according to the truth of the spirit and the law of its manifestation is not mental but supramental, and even in its formulation nearest to mind as much above the mental consciousness in its light and power as the mental consciousness of man above the vital mind of the lower creation. The question is how far the perfected human being can raise himself above mind, enter into some kind of fusing union with the supramental and build up in himself a level of supermind, a developed gnosis by the form and power of which the divine Shakti can directly act, not through a mental translation, but organically in her supramental nature. The question is how far the perfected human being can raise himself above mind, enter into some kind of fusing union with the supramental and build up in himself a level of supermind, a developed gnosis by the form and power of which the divine Shakti can directly act, not through a mental translation, but organically in her supramental nature. It is here necessary in a matter so remote from the ordinary lines of our thought and experience to state first what is the universal gnosis or divine supermind, how it is represented in the actual movement of the universe and what are its relations to the present psychology of the human being. The ordinary man tries to command it mechanically by physical exercises and other corporeal means, the Hathyogen more greatly and flexibly, but still mechanically by asana and pranayama, but for our purpose it can be commanded by more subtle, essential and pliable means, first, by a will in the mind widely opening itself to and potently calling in the universal pranic Shakti on which we draw and fixing its stronger presence and more powerful working in the body, secondly, by the will in the mind opening itself rather to the spirit and its power and calling in a higher pranic energy from above, a supramental pranic force, thirdly, the last step, by the highest supramental will of the spirit entering and taking up directly the task of the perfection of the body. In the end they must undergo a spiritual and supramental transfiguration. There are 4 members of this second part of the sadhana or discipline of self-perfection, and the first of them is right Shakti, the right condition of the powers of the intelligence, heart, vital mind and body. It is evident that if we are to have a free divine or spiritual and supramental action conducted by the force and fulfilling the character of a diviner energy, some fairly complete transformation must be effected in this outward character of the bodily nature. But afterwards the mind must itself give place to the spirit, to the spiritual force, the supermind and the supramental force. And finally the body must develop a perfect power to hold whatever force is brought into it by the spirit and to contain its action without spilling and wasting it or itself getting cracked. They will then be ready for the transformation into their own supramental action, in which they will find a more absolute, unified and luminous spiritual truth of the whole perfected nature. And, secondly, the universal Shakti must be realized, must be seen and felt and born in the potent purity of its higher action, its supramental and spiritual workings. This greater vision of the Shakti will enable us to escape from the control of the gunas, to convert them into their divine equivalents and dwell in a consciousness in which the Purusha and Prakriti are one and not separated or hidden in or behind each other. The transformation, the perfection cannot for the integral yoga be complete until the link between the mental and the spiritual action is formed and a higher knowledge applied to all the activities of our existence. That link is the supramental or Gnostic energy in which the incalculable infinite power of the Supreme Being, consciousness, delight formulates itself as an ordering divine will and wisdom, a light and power in the being which shapes all the thought, will, feeling, action and replaces the corresponding individual movements. That link is the supramental or Gnostic energy in which the incalculable infinite power of the Supreme Being, consciousness, delight formulates itself as an ordering divine will and wisdom, a light and power in the being which shapes all the thought, will, feeling, action and replaces the corresponding individual movements. This supramental Shakti may form itself as a spiritualized intuitive light and power in the mind itself, and that is a great but still a mentally limited spiritual action. Or it may transform altogether the mind and raise the whole being to the supramental level. In any case, this is the first necessity of this part of the yoga, to lose the ego of the door, the ego idea and the sense of one's own power of action and initiation of action and control of the result of action and merge it in the sense and vision of the universal Shakti originating, shaping, turning to its ends the action of ourselves and others and of all the persons and forces of the world. And this realization can become absolute and complete in all the parts of our being only if we can have that sense and vision of it in all its forms, on all the levels of our being and the world being, as the material, vital, mental and supramental energy of the divine. But all these, all the powers of all the planes must be seen and known as self-formulations of the one spiritual Shakti, infinite in being, consciousness and Ananda. But it is also possible to make this silence of the mind and ability to suspend the habits of the lower nature a first step towards the discovery of a superior formulation, a higher grade of the status and energy of our being and pass by an ascent and transformation into the supramental power of the Spirit. And this may even, though with more difficulty, be done without resorting to the complete state of quietude of the normal mind by a persistent and progressive transformation of all the mental into their greater corresponding supramental powers and activities. And this may even, though with more difficulty, be done without resorting to the complete state of quietude of the normal mind by a persistent and progressive transformation of all the mental into their greater corresponding supramental powers and activities. For everything in the mind derives from and is a limited, inferior, groping, partial or perverse translation into mentality of something in the supermind. For the supermind is the divine mind, and it is on the supramental plane that the individual arrives at his right, integral, luminous and perfect relation with the supreme and universal Purusha and the supreme and universal Prakriti. And as the crown of this process she will bring down the supramental light into the mental levels, change the stuff of mind into the stuff of supermind, transform all the lower energies into energies of her supramental nature and raise us into our being of gnosis. And as the crown of this process she will bring down the supramental light into the mental levels, change the stuff of mind into the stuff of supermind, transform all the lower energies into energies of her supramental nature and raise us into our being of gnosis. This rule persists so long as the mental buddhi is the chief instrument, but when the supramental light takes possession of mind and heart, then there can be no trouble, grief or disturbance, for that brings with it a spiritual nature of illumined strength in which these things can have no place. The mind must become a silent luminous channel for the revelations of the supramental truth and of the will involved in its seeing. For the base of it is still calm, it is an even and tranquil neutral joy, a haituka. And as the supramental light grows, a greater Ananda comes, the base of the abundant ecstasy of the Spirit in all it is, becomes, sees, experiences and of the laughter of the Shakti doing luminously the work of the divine and taking his Ananda in all the worlds. There can be no failure, for whatever happens is the intention of the Master of the worlds, not final, but a step on his way, and if it appears as an opposition, a defeat, a denial, even for the moment a total denial of the aim set before the instrumental being, it is so only in appearance and afterwards it will appear in its right place in the economy of his action, A fuller supramental vision may even see at once or beforehand its necessity and its true relation to the eventual result to which it seems so contrary, and even perhaps its definite prohibition. And indeed at one stage in the yoga it becomes necessary to refuse to accept as definite and final any kind of intellectual idea or opinion whatever in its intellectual form, and to hold it in a questioning suspension until it is given its right place and luminous shape of truth in a spiritual experience enlightened by supramental knowledge. And much more must this be the case with the desires or impulsions of the life-mind, which have often to be provisionally accepted as immediate indices of a temporarily necessary action before we have the full guidance, but not always clung to with the soul's complete assent, for eventually all these desires and impulsions have to be rejected or else transformed into and replaced by impulsions of the divine will taking up the life movements. This the English word faith is inadequate to express it, is in reality an influence from the Supreme Spirit and its lighter message from our supramental being, which is calling the lower nature to rise out of its petty present to a great self-becoming and self-exceeding. The progress of the yoga is a procession from the mental ignorance through imperfect formations to a perfect foundation and increasing of knowledge, and in its more satisfyingly positive parts a movement from light to greater light. And it cannot cease till we have the greatest light of the supramental knowledge. The motions of the mind in its progress must necessarily be mixed with a greater or lesser proportion of error, and we should not allow our faith to be disconcerted by the discovery of its errors, or imagine that because the beliefs of the intellect which aided us were too hasty and positive, therefore the fundamental faith in the soul was invalid. She is Maheshwari, goddess of the supreme knowledge, and brings to us her vision for all kinds and widenesses of truth, her rectitude of the spiritual will, the calm and passion of her supramental largeness, her felicity of illumination. She is Mahakali, goddess of the supreme strength, and with her are all mights and spiritual force and severest austerity of tapas and swiftness to the battle and the victory and the laughter, the asya, that makes light of defeat and death and the powers of the ignorance. She is Mahalakshmi, the goddess of the supreme love and delight, and her gifts are the spirit's grace and the charm and beauty of the Ananda and protection and every divine and human blessing. She is Mahasaraswati, the goddess of divine skill and of the works of the spirit, and hers is the yoga that is skill in works, yoga karmasu kausalam, and the utilities of divine knowledge and the self-application of the spirit to life and the happiness of its harmonies. And that highest perfection of the Rad will also be the opportunity and perfect foundation of a divine strength. It will base, when complete, the development and manifestation and the works of the luminous supramental Shakti. Sakalpa, Vyavasya. This liberation gets its completeness when the spiritual gnosis can act with a supramental knowledge and reception of the action of nature and a supramental luminous will in initiation. The gnosis discovers the spiritual sense in nature, God in things, the soul of good in all things that have the contrary appearance. That soul is delivered in them and out of them. The perversions of the imperfect or contrary forms fall away or are transformed into their higher divine truth, even as the gunas go back to their divine principles, and the spirit lives in a universal, infinite and absolute truth, good, beauty, bliss, which is the supramental or ideal divine nature. The liberation of the nature becomes one with the liberation of the spirit, and there is founded in the integral freedom the integral perfection. This equality will not respond to the lower impulses, but watch for a greater seeing impulsion from the light above the mind, and will not judge and govern with the intellectual judgment, but wait for enlightenment and direction from a superior plane of vision. As it mounts upward to the supramental being and widens inward to the spiritual largeness, the dynamic nature will be transformed, spiritualized like the emotional and pranic, and grow into a power of the divine nature. This equality is the most delicate and difficult of all, the least practiced by the human mind. Its perfection is impossible so long as the supramental light does not fall fully on the upward-looking mentality. The voice of poetry comes from a region above us, a plane of our being above and beyond our personal intelligence, a supermind which sees things in their innermost and largest truth by a spiritual identity and with a lustrous effulgency and rapture, and its native language is a revelatory, inspired, intuitive word, limpid or subtly vibrant or densely packed with the glory of this ecstasy and luster. It is the possession of the mind by the supramental touch and the communicated impulse to seize this sight and word that creates the psychological phenomenon of poetic inspiration, and it is the invasion of it by a superior power to that which it is normally able to harbor that produces the temporary excitement of brain and heart and nerve which accompanies the inrush of the influence. And the more we can light up the veil and have the direct transmission, the greater the force of inspiration and revelation, and the nearer we shall get to an absolute and inevitable word straight from the supramental sight and language. The most characteristic trend of recent poetry has been an attempt, sometimes lucid, sometimes half understanding or obscure, to break open the doors of the luminous cavern and to get the seeing and phrase which would be that of this intuitive self of our intelligence and imagination and sensation and life and feeling. And a kindred passage may also be cited from the Isha, in which Surya the sun god is invoked as the godhead of knowledge, whose supreme form of effulgence is the oneness of the spirit, and his rays dispersed here on the mental level are the shining diffusion of the thought mind and conceal his own infinite supramental truth, the body and self of this sun, the truth of the spirit and the eternal. The face of the truth is covered with a golden lid, O Fosteriac sun, that uncover for the law of the truth, for sight. The symbols here are still obscure to our intelligence, but indications are given which show beyond doubt that they are representations of a psychical experience leading to different states of spiritual realization, and we can sect that these are three: outward, mental and supramental, and as the result of the last a supreme perfection, a complete and integral action of the whole being in the tranquil eternity of the immortal spirit. This equality of the intelligence is an essential condition for rising to the higher supramental and spiritual knowledge. The will in us, because it is the most generally forceful power of our being, there is a will of knowledge, a will of life, a will of emotion, a will acting in every part of our nature, takes many forms and returns various reactions to things, such as incapacity, limitation of power, mastery, or right will, wrong or perverted will, neutral volition, in the ethical mind virtue, sin and non-ethical volition, and others of the kind. This equality will open the nature to the guidance of the divine and universal will and make it ready for that supramental action in which the power of the soul in us is luminously full of and one with the power of the Supreme Spirit. That is to be found beyond these lower principles in the supramental gnosis. Therefore the next step of perfection will be the evolution of the mental into the Gnostic being. That is a luminous spiritual and in its native action a direct supramental light of knowledge, Jyoti, not the modified and derivative mental light, Praka. Such a station of consciousness there is in our supramental ranges where the soul is one with the Supreme and with the universal, not only in essence of consciousness and spiritual truth of being, but in expressive act too of consciousness and being, an initiating and relating truth of spiritual will and knowledge and the soul's overflowing delight in God and existence. In other words, the divine is at once the soul of matter and the soul of life and the soul of mind and the soul of the supramental light of being. Thus the divine is manifest in the double soul of existence, Dvave Malpurushau, the spirit of mutable things who is all these existences, Kshara Sarvani Bhutani, and the immutable spirit standing above them in his imperturbable immobility of eternal silence and calm. And it is by the force of the divine in them that the knowledge and being of man are so powerfully drawn as if by opposing and incompatible attractions. It is attained when the mind exceeds itself by the supramental, the high spiritual seeing of things, and when the heart too rises in unison beyond the more ignorant mental forms of love and devotion to the love that is luminous with the widest knowledge, to the supreme delight and adoration of the divine, to the spiritual Ananda. And it is the Purushottama, the eternal Godhead, the supreme soul of all beings and all nature, the original transcendent spirit, of whom an immutable impersonal self-existence is the first spiritual presence and substance revealed to the experience of our liberated knowledge, and a universal and transcendent person or Purusha, the mysterious secret of his being, unthinkable in form of mind, Achintyarupa, but very near and present to the powers of our consciousness, emotion, will, knowledge when they are lifted out of themselves into a supramental, a spiritual delight and power and gnosis. It is he, transcendent absolute but also friend and Lord and enlightener and lover, who is the object of this devotion and approach and this intimate inner becoming and surrender. As there is a supramental thought and essential consciousness, so too there is a supramental sense. Sense is fundamentally not the action of certain physical organs, but the contact of consciousness with its objects, sajnana. Finally, a fourth action of the supramental consciousness completes the various possibilities of the supramental knowledge. It is a contacting of existence, presences, things, forms, forces, activities, but a contacting of them in the stuff of the supramental being and energy, not in the divisions of matter and through the physical instruments, that creates the supramental sense, sajnana. It is a little difficult to make the nature of the supramental sense understood to a mentality not yet familiar with it by enlarged experience, because our idea of sense action is governed by the limiting experience of the physical mind, and we suppose that the fundamental thing in it is the impression made by an external object on the physical organ of sight, hearing, smell, touch, taste, and that the business of the mind, the present central organ of our consciousness, is only to receive the physical impression and its nervous translation, and so become intelligently conscious of the object. This sense, even at its lowest power, is luminous with a revealing light that carries in it the secret of the thing it experiences, and can therefore be a starting point and basis of all the rest of the supramental knowledge, the supramental thought, spiritual intelligence and comprehension, conscious identity, and on its highest plane or at its fullest intensity of action it opens into or contains and at once liberates these things. And finally all is lifted up and taken into the supermind and made a part of the infinitely luminous consciousness, knowledge and experience of the supramental being, the Vijnana Purusha. The state of the being after this supramental transformation will be in all its parts of consciousness and knowledge that of an infinite and cosmic consciousness acting through the universalized individual Purusha. There is evolved not only a supramental thought, but a supramental will, sense, feeling, a supramental substitute for all the activities that are now accomplished by the mind. In all these there will be the same character of a spirit seeing and willing directly above and around and not only in the body it possesses, and there will be the same action of the supramental knowledge by identity, the supramental vision, the supramental thought and supramental word, separately or in a united movement. The harmony, the unity are inevitable because the base in the supermind is knowledge and characteristically self-knowledge, the knowledge of the self in all its aspects. The supramental will is the dynamic expression of this self-knowledge, the supramental feeling the expression of the luminous joy of the self, and all else in supermind a part of this one movement. But as the mind becomes intuitivized and supramentalized, these powers are purified and corrected by the more luminous action of the supermind and become themselves forms of a supramental and a true seeing. The supramental vision, it may be noted, brings with it a supplementary and completing experience that might be called a spiritual hearing and touch of the truth, of its essence and through that of its significance, that is to say, there is a seizing of its movement, vibration, rhythm and a seizing of its close presence and contact and substance. In all these respects the supramental man must proceed from the opposite principle of truth vision. The supramental being sees things from above in large spaces and at the highest from the spaces of the infinite. This is transformed on the higher level to the true jna, supramental thought, supramental vision, the supramental knowledge by identity. The thing that is created is the self-determination of a harmony, and all harmony proceeds upon seen or given lines and carries with it a constant pulsation and rhythmic recurrence. The supramental thought, organizing the harmony of manifested existence of the supramental being, founds it on eternal principles, casts it upon the right lines of the truth that is to be manifested, keeps sounding as characteristic notes the recurrence of the constant elements in the experience and the action which are necessary to constitute the harmony. These are put in their place either by an attendant intuitive or interpretative judgment, or by one inherent in the vision of the image, symbol or potentiality, or by a supereminent revelation of that which is behind the image or symbol, or which determines the potential and the actual and their relations and, it may be, overrides and overpasses them, imposing ultimate truths and supreme certitude. The supramental judgment acts inseparably from the supramental observation or memory, inherent in it as a direct seeing or cognition of values, significances, antecedents, consequences, relations, etc., or it supervenes on the observation as a luminous disclosing idea or suggestion, or it may go before, independent of any observation, and then the object called up and observed confirms visibly the truth of the idea. The supermind, the divine gnosis, is not something entirely alien to our present consciousness. It is a superior instrumentation of the spirit, and all the operations of our normal consciousness are limited and inferior derivations from the supramental, because these are tentatives and constructions, that the true and perfect, the spontaneous and harmonious nature and action of the spirit. It does not limit itself either to the transformation of the superficial powers and action of the mind and psychic parts and the life, but it manifests and transforms also those rarer powers and that larger force and knowledge proper to our subliminal self that appear now to us as things occult, curiously psychic, abnormal. These things become in the supramental nature not at all abnormal but perfectly natural and normal, not separately psychic but spiritual, not occult and strange, but a direct, simple, inherent and spontaneous action. The character of limitation applies to the supermind itself when it descends into the mental level and works in the lesser substance of mentality, though in its own manner and body of power and light, and it persists even in the action of the supramental reason. It is only the higher supramental Shakti acting on its own ranges whose will and knowledge work always in a boundless light or with a free capacity of illimitable extension of knowledge subject only to such limitations as are self-imposed for its own purposes and at its own will by the spirit. All being, consciousness, knowledge moves, secretly for our present surface awareness, openly when we rise beyond it to the spiritual and supramental ranges, between two states and powers of existence, that of the timeless infinite and that of the infinite deploying in itself and organizing all things in time. In reality, as we find when we see things with a knowledge founded on the supramental identity and vision and think with the great, profound and flexible logic proper to that knowledge, the two are only coexistent and concurrent status and movement of the same truth of the infinite. The consciousness of the timeless infinite can be brought home to us in various ways, but is most ordinarily imposed on our mentality by a reflection of it and a powerful impression or else made present to us as something above the mind, something of which it is aware, towards which it lifts, but into which it cannot enter because itself lives only in the time sense and in the succession of the moments. If our present mind untransformed by the supramental influence tries to enter into the timeless, it must either disappear and be lost in the trance of samadhi or else, remaining awake, it feels itself diffused in an infinite where there is perhaps a sense of supraphysical space, a vastness, a boundless extension of consciousness, but no time self, time movement or time order. The action that then remains possible to the mental Purusha is the mechanical action of the instruments of the Prakriti continuing by force of old impulsion and habit or continued initiation of past energy, prabdha, or else an action chaotic, unregulated, uncoordinated, a confused precipitate from an energy which has no longer a conscious center. The supramental consciousness on the other hand is founded upon the supreme consciousness of the timeless infinite, but has too the secret of the deployment of the infinite energy in time. There are three elevations in this reason, one in which the action of what we may call a supramental intuition gives the form and the predominant character, one in which a rapid supramental inspiration and one in which a large supramental revelation leads and imparts the general character, and each of these raises us to a more concentrated substance and a higher light, sufficiency and scope of the truth will and the truth knowledge. The intuitive mind is an immediate translation of truth into mental terms half transformed by a radiant supramental substance, a translation of some infinite self-knowledge that acts above mind in the superconscient spirit. The intuitive mentality then becomes a secondary and inferior movement waiting upon this higher power, responding and assenting to all its illuminations and dictates, transmitting them to the lower members, and, when they do not arrive or are not in immediate evidence, often attempting to supply its place, imitate its action and do as best it can the works of the supramental nature. It takes in fact the same place and relation with regard to it as was taken with regard to itself by the ordinary intelligence at an earlier stage of the yoga. And more it intensifies the intuitive mentality itself in its light of knowledge and eventually transforms it into the image of the supermind itself, but at first, ordinarily, in the more limited action of the gnosis when it takes the form of what we might call a luminous supramental or divine reason. It is as this divine reason that the supermind itself at the beginning may manifest its action, and then, when it has changed the mind into its own image, it descends and takes the place of the ordinary intelligence and reason. It is as this divine reason that the supermind itself at the beginning may manifest its action, and then, when it has changed the mind into its own image, it descends and takes the place of the ordinary intelligence and reason. Meanwhile, a higher supramental power of a much greater character has been revealing itself above, which takes the supreme lead of the divine action in the being. There is in the world of birth an energy of physical being and nature, arising out of the physical, an energy of vital being and nature, arising out of the vital, an energy of mental being and nature, arising out of the mental, an energy of spiritual or supramental being and nature. And each of these forms of energy has a law of its own, lines of its own action, a right to its own manner of operation and existence, because each is fundamental to some necessity of the whole.